Have you ever wondered about how we arrived at some of the strategies that we now know to be GTO or to be optimal in various scenarios? Well, throughout the history of poker, there's been a big evolution in what we thought was correct in certain spots. In today's video, we're going to discuss that in some depth. Hi Wizards, I'm Matt Hunt, and we are talking about 5 GTO discoveries that changed how pros played poker. Firstly, we have push-fold strategies. Now, while Nash equilibrium concepts have been applied to poker since the 1960s, the first push-fold software actually didn't arrive until the mid-2000s. Its name was GTO Wizard, abbreviated to GTOWizard, and it's a significant predecessor to GTO Wizard, of course, but it revolutionized the way that players approached online sit-and-goes, small tournaments with a specific number of players, which were one of the most popular formats at the time. I personally remember using this software when I was grinding sit-and-goes in maybe, I would say, 2010 or 2011. Understanding basic push-fold ranges for short stack spots was a massive edge at that time, much more so than it is now. And even though this tool couldn't really even do ICM calculations very well, it was still incredibly powerful just in the way that it helped players to understand chip EV push-fold strategies. Of course, these days we have much more advanced technology, but let's take a look at an example in the GTO Wizard solution archive to illustrate how a certain spot might have been played before we really had push-fold tech available to us. So this right here is a basic MTT spot, chip EV, 10 big blinds deep, and it's folded around to the button. Now back in the day, in the pre-solver era, before we even really had the power to calculate push-fold ranges, we might not necessarily have recognized that 10 big blinds was a stack size where shoving could be very effective. We might even have thought that it was actually too deep to be shoving, because back in the day when No Limit Hold'em was pretty new and Limit Hold'em had been the standard up to that point, well, in Limit Hold'em you can't shove pre-flop. So understanding that we can actually shove in this spot with more than 30% of hands is not something that would have been possible without the discoveries that came from a solver or an early calculator like GTOWizard. And in this spot, of course, these days we can actually even calculate that we should limp some hands. And as you can see, the solver does want to limp here. In fact, it doesn't want to min raise at all. But if you went back 20 years, it might have been common to see players min-raising in situations like this from the button off of a 10 big blind stack because we simply didn't have a lot of understanding of push-fold in how it actually gets executed in real time. We might have understood that at short stacks you can go all in, but we really didn't know exactly what the ranges looked like. So that was an important discovery that changed tournament poker significantly over the years. Our second GTO discovery is range betting. Now, I have put out a video about range betting recently, which you can go check out, which explores the concept in more detail. But generally, if we're looking at the history of this idea, post-flop solvers were the next evolution of GTO strategy that came along after push-fold, and it was in the mid-2010s, early to mid-2010s, that we really started to have access to post-flop solvers. With these solvers came a new wave of innovations, and the simplest and most straightforward of these was the revelation that, in fact, you can just bet all your hands in a lot of spots. Range betting all boards for 1/3 pot became a very effective strategy for several years. It was actually pretty common, particularly in cash games, to see people taking a range bet 1/3 approach simply because they understood that their opponents were not continuing enough against this size, were not check raising enough, and so on. In fact, even nowadays, it won't do that badly if you just range bet every single board for a small size, and your opponents will probably still make some mistakes against it. So this spot right here that I've pulled up is a pretty generic cash game spot. It's a 500 NL 6 max spot with a 2.5x open, low jack opens, and the big blind defends, and the flop comes ace, ace, queen, 2 hearts. Now, clearly, as you can see here from the betting frequencies, the solver is choosing to essentially range bet here. There's only 0.7% check, so that's essentially a range bet. And this is something that maybe 20 years back, even 15 years back, we probably would not have recognized as being a range bet board. It's ace, ace, queen. It is a board that is naturally going to favor the pre-flop raiser in a lot of ways, but it might not have been that easy to identify immediately that this was a good range bet spot. In fact, we really didn't have the terminology to even explore it in those terms. We didn't really talk about range betting back then. And I say this as somebody who's been around in poker for 15 years and remembers what strategy discussions were like back then. I can guarantee you the idea of range betting did not exist, simply because the idea of a range was still pretty new. So overall, something like this, where we can range bet, and in fact we can use a range bet for half pot potentially even here, because there is a good chunk of half potting in this sim, that would be something that was completely unfamiliar until the advent of post-flop solvers allowed us to discover that concept. So our third GTO discovery that changed how pros played poker is overbetting. Now, as solvers became more widely used, what happened is players were more aware of what the most important later street strategies were. And overbetting was by far the most significant of these, because in a span of 1 to 2 years, overbets went from a very rare occurrence to being extremely commonplace. Now, today we recognize that overbetting is central to our ability to maximize EV in many spots, but back in the day, we simply didn't. If you go back to 2010, 2012, that kind of era, if you watch live streams from that time period, you won't find a lot of overbetting. You'll find certain players that embraced the power of overbetting and understood how it could benefit their strategy, but you won't find it being that common. But of course, as solvers became more widely used, it then became a crucial part of anybody's strategy. So let's take a look at an example. So this right here is an example from our GTO Wizard archive. It's a cash game spot. We open in the cutoff at 100 bigs, big blind calls. We bet 33% on the flop, and we get called, and then we see the turn. And what we can do here is look at aggregate reports for the turn. And as you can see, there is a pretty good chunk of overbetting being done here. 175% at some frequency, 125% at a pretty reasonable frequency. And there's going to be certain specific turn cards where the overbet is quite prevalent. It's quite a significant part of the strategy. If we filter for frequency here, we can see that the most common cards for the overbet are going to be a jack, a 10, an 8, a queen, cards like that that are pretty much just a turn brick. And the overbet, by extension, then, is going to be a pretty important part of the overall game tree for this player in position on the turn. It's going to really help to maximize EV in many spots. If you do eliminate overbetting from your strategy altogether, there's plenty of situations where it actually does cost you quite a bit of EV. And back in the day, this is something we didn't really know about until we started working with solvers. We didn't really understand that not overbetting in a spot that is an overbet spot costs a lot of EV. So this was a big discovery that really influenced the way that basically anybody who really studies poker seriously was approaching and reflecting upon the game in very specific scenarios. Now, our fourth GTO discovery is blockers and unblockers. Now, while PLO players have been pretty aware of blockers for a long time, the concept only really arrived in No Limit Hold'em within the 2010s. Solvers have taught us that certain specific combinations of hands have very powerful bluffing properties in some spots, and of course bluff catching properties as well. They've also taught us that unblocking our opponent's folding hands can also be valuable, especially when we're choosing our turn and river bluffs. There are plenty of spots where the solver will choose to barrel the turn with a certain hand just because it unblocks all the folds. Let's take a look at a spot where blockers are very relevant. So this is the same board texture that we just looked at, and in this case, we didn't overbet the turn, we bet 75% of pot. Now we get to the river, and the river is a 3 of hearts, which puts a straight and a flush up on the board. Now when it checks to the in-position player here on the river in the cutoff, you can see that a pretty decent chunk of bluffs here are going to contain the ace of hearts. In fact, the ace of hearts jack or the ace of hearts king, for example, actually has the power to go as big as an all-in shove here. And if we look at the construction of the range here in this spot for the in-position player, if we go to filters and we go to trash hands and we take a look at the hands that are bluffing at the highest frequencies, well, take a look at how they're constructed. The ace of hearts or the king of hearts is a high frequency bet here. In fact, these combos actually even have the ability to bet way bigger than you might expect at some frequency. Ace of Hearts King is overbetting a pretty good chunk of the time. It's betting the 87% fairly often. And in fact, if we look at Ace of Hearts Jack, there's actually a little bit of all-in shoving going on here. Something like Ace of Hearts Jack of Diamonds wants to jam all in for 4x pot at some frequency here. So clearly, this is something that is greatly affected by the blocking properties of the hand. Being able to block the nut flush and being able to block the backdoor straight is very, very powerful here. So that Ace of Hearts blocker, even though a PLO player and even most no-limit hold'em players would be able to identify that this is a pretty good card to have, we didn't really know before we had solver tech available how powerful it could be. We didn't really know that there are certain spots where if you have that nut blocker, you can really just make a huge bet and put tons of pressure on your opponent in certain kinds of spots. A great advantage of studying with solvers right there. So our final GTO discovery here is the concept of equity denial. Now, it's only really been in recent years, the last 5 years or so, that we've really been able to flesh this concept out in the right way. What we see is that frequently solvers are going to prioritize value betting larger on earlier streets with vulnerable value hands. And in the past, players might have done this for protection. But while we know that protection is strategically relevant, these days we recognize that it's more about overcards than it is about draws. Pricing out the draw, giving them a bad price with a flush draw, it's not really something we can do because they're just not likely to fold the flush draw one way or the other. They're not supposed to. But they are supposed to fold their overcard hands sometimes. And quite often, that makes a big difference. Let me show you what I mean. So this is another cash game sim, just like the one we looked at previously. It's cutoff big blind, 100 big blinds, and the flop is 10-8-5. But in this case, what I've done is I've run it with GTO Wizard AI, and I've simplified the flop strategy to two sizes of half pot and full pot. And what we can do is if we hone in on, for example, an overpair hand, we can see that pocket jacks has a significantly stronger preference for betting here than any of the other pocket pairs. Jacks is going to never check, while queens is checking a little bit, kings a little bit more, and aces maybe almost half the time. And in addition to that, jacks is more inclined to bet bigger than any of the other pocket pairs as well. Jacks is actually favoring maybe a 50-50 split of these two sizes, judging by what we can see here. Now, if we look at the equity of these hands, it's not that different. Equity reading, jacks 76.9, aces 80.2. So they're very similar strengths of hands. But if we look at how they fit into the overall strategy, there's a good chunk of hands that are favoring this larger bet. And it's a lot of vulnerable value. It's ace 10, king 10, pocket jacks, hands like that, even pocket fives as well, although that's mostly just for pure value, more so than because it's vulnerable. But you can see that the vulnerable value, the ace 10, king 10, pocket jacks, that type of hand actually has a bit of a preference for betting bigger. This is to deny the equity to some of those overcard hands, because even though those overcard hands are not drawing very live against our hand, what happens is when we narrow down the calling range on the flop, it actually allows us to have a little bit more leeway to value bet more liberally on later streets because we're less concerned about our opponent turning top pair. So it actually creates a circumstance where certain turn cards that would otherwise be making us a little bit cautious no longer do make us cautious because we bet bigger and all their overcards actually folded. So this is kind of an interesting concept. It's not an easy one to apply in a lot of detail, but it is one that we really understand now that we can run solver sims that have multiple sizes, and particularly now that we can use GTO Wizard AI to very rapidly run sims that can test different sizes against each other. We can see these trends emerge in terms of the sizes that the solvers prefer in various spots. So that's going to be it for this video. Those are the 5 GTO discoveries that changed how pros play poker. I can only imagine what GTO discoveries are going to exist in future that we'll figure out once we have even more advanced solver tech available. And you can be sure that when that tech is available, GTO Wizard is going to be right at the forefront of putting that technology out there and making it accessible for you guys. So I hope you liked this video. If you do want more content of a similar nature, please check out my own channel, Poker Fluency. I'll be doing daily coaching sessions up on YouTube every weekday going forward, and I hope to see some of you there. Please do check out this video right here that you can see linked if you'd like to see some other content of mine here on our YouTube channel. And in the meantime, I'll be back soon with another video. Thanks everybody, and good luck.